Welcome to the BIG5D podcast, featuring focused conversations with the region's technology thought leaders, hosted by me, Charles Laughlin, editor-in-chief of Big5 Digital. This episode of the BIG5D podcast is brought to you by Fractional.dev. Fractional connects developers and organizations with each other for short to medium-term projects. You can find them at fractional.dev. Hello, welcome to the BIG5D podcast. I'm Charles Laughlin. I'm the content director for Big5 Digital, and today I'm joined by Imtiyaz Mohamed. He's the principal consultant at Realm Digital. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Charles. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So, before we get into the subject of the day, which is AR/VR, which is an area that your firm is one of the areas your firm is focused on, we just kind of want to have a little bit of a mini masterclass on that today. But before we get into that, let's talk about what Realm Digital is or who Realm Digital is. Just give us the very brief who you are, what you do, and why AR/VR is in your wheelhouse, and then we'll carry on from there.
And so Round Digital is a technology company. We basically broken up into three different streams. One is consulting, kind of like your strategy, innovation, kind of your bread and butter consulting division. We also have a development division, design, UX, UI, and I think more importantly, what we're talking about today, emerging tech, together with a talent division as well. So that's kind of like end to end. That's who we are in a nutshell. But yeah, that's about it.
Okay, all right, we'll carry on from there. So AR/VR, it's something I know a little bit about, and having a little bit of knowledge is always dangerous, right? So why don't we start out by you giving us the lay of the land, sort of give us a sense of the size, scope of this industry, and then what I'd really like is a statement from you that separates hype from reality. What is real in AR/VR now? And then we'll dig in from there. Let's start with that.
And it's like I'm glad you kind of posed it to me like this as well, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around VR, AR in the environment currently now as well. So I think a lot of people think about it as gaming and purely gaming, but there's a lot of practical use cases, and I think we'll delve into this
Mhm.
conversation. Let me maybe just start off from the beginning and like what is VR and what's the difference between VR and AR?
Sounds like a good place to start. Yeah.
Virtual reality is basically virtual reality is basically creating a new world where you're completely immersed in
Mhm.
terms of that. Augmented reality is basically taking the current world and augmenting it. So basically adding elements of digital
Right.
to the original world as well. So yeah,
And I
so
know
that's
this reference is going to be cringe for you, but I think most people's understanding of augmented reality was brought to their attention by Pokemon Go.
no, that was exactly the example I was actually going to use in terms of
Okay.
augmented reality. Pokemon Go, the best example you can do. Filters on your social media, Snapchat or Instagram or anything else, also
Mhm.
augmented reality in terms of that as well. And then
Right.
I think a new popular term, which is kind of where the future is heading, is mixed reality. So that became quite popular with the launch of the Apple Vision Pro,
Mhm.
which obviously everybody's got excited for, but there's no real use cases that's put out there as yet. But in
And I
truth,
wanted to get into that later,
yeah,
perhaps,
yeah.
about kind of the impact it's had. But carry on. Sorry.
But yeah, so that's kind of like the differences between virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. And I think that like that's where a lot of guys kind of start to get confused as well. Just in terms of like statistically how big the industry is, we're looking at about it growing to be a $58 billion industry
That's
for
globally.
globally, like for AR and VR by 2028, which is kind of the predicted
Okay, so in 4 years, you said 50
yeah,
billion ish.
58 billion. Yeah.
Where? How does that revenue break down? Just broadly speaking, you don't have to get too
So
deep
it's
into that.
broken up into kind of like VR applications in the form of advertisements, activations, training use cases as well, and
Hmm.
in terms of AR as well, in terms of breaking it down into the same similar vein in terms of activation, VR, in terms of
Hmm.
implementation as well. So I mean, there's definitely like a kind of a use case around it in terms of where guys are going and heading into it.
Is advertising sort of the default early revenue stream, and then it'll evolve into something else? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think the easier point for the adoption of the technology was around advertising. So I think a
Hmm.
lot of times advertising and marketing, like that's kind of where a lot of the adoption would take place at the early stage as well. But the technology is advanced at such a rapid rate that the other use cases are really in the training and development space, where I
Mhm.
really feel that that's where AR and VR actually plays such a vital role in terms of where we head at.
So that's interesting because again, one of the one of the areas where I've sort of just done a little bit of research on at a very light level on how it's particularly augmented reality is applied in the sort of one example I remember coming across, and I'm really not sure how widely used it is now. It's in home services where,
Mm.
let's say, a plumber or an electrician or somebody who comes to your house normally to fix something, instead of that, will guide you using AR to fix it yourself.
So
That was
yeah,
an interesting to me, an interesting use case. I don't know if that's scaled at all, but that seems adjacent to the training example you've been citing. So, could you give a couple examples of, I don't know if it's at the enterprise level or whatever, where that training case is being deployed?
no, for sure. And it's, I think, let me, can I, if I can just take one step back and just talk about the
Sure.
technology that you would need in order to do this. So for virtual reality, you'd usually use a headset, something like you'd call the Oculus
Right.
Quest 3, for example, which is the latest one now, putting you directly into virtual reality. There are other types and makes, but that's generally like the pioneer or the
Mhm.
leading edge. Then you've got AR, which is kind of like just utilizing your phone. So anything that
Right.
you
You
could
just
do
pointed at things, right? Yeah. Yeah.
that kind of mobile device.
Hmm.
And then obviously mixed reality would be a combination. You could use your VR headset as a mixed reality headset as well, but Apple Vision Pro, let's use that
Hmm.
for for example as one of the mixed reality kind of headsets as well. So the other thing about virtual reality, and that's very important to know, that is that the graphics are really good in terms of creating realistic experiences in virtual reality, but you can actually push it further in terms of connecting it up to a gaming PC as well. So
Hmm.
once you start doing that, you can actually pull the resolution to a point where I can pick up a piece of cloth and see the fiber count in terms of
Oh.
kind of moving there as well. So it's important just to kind of know the text, the technology stack, and then kind of understand the actual mechanisms of how you use it. Then just in terms of like experiences and how you use it in terms of like training and everything else as well. In different spaces, I think one of the cool spaces was retail. So think
Hmm.
about the retail space. You could jump into virtual reality, like walk through malls. You could try on different clothes as well. In terms of like spatial planning, so what generally stores do is they actually build mock-ups on like pieces of paper sometimes, or
Hmm.
sometimes software as well, which is two-dimensional in terms of what they do. Imagine creating a space and putting on virtual reality and saying, you know what, I want the women's clothing section over here. And then afterwards, I'm like, no, I want it over here and I want to move it over. Can I imagine like store planning in a different kind of light in terms of that? That's kind of one practical use case as well.
Okay.
And augmented reality is basically similar kind of thing. What if you're using the physical building and overlaying that with the digital kind of elements to build the store? That's a typical example in terms of retail.
Hmm.
In terms of different other industries, I could go on and on, but I mean, travel industry, how do you start to experience destinations to start to really understand if this is the place you want to go to? You could do a
Yeah.
virtual walkthrough as well. The other cool thing about like virtual reality in the education space as well is it's one thing teaching kids about how a volcano works, but what if you actually put them in the center of a volcano, showing them how things
Right.
erupt? So, like different sectors, different use cases. And like the saying always goes, and I know it sounds very cliche, but whatever you can imagine you could do, um, it's literally
Yeah.
it's with us at this moment in time.
So I want to bring up. I was thinking of bringing this up later, but you mentioned it already. So let's talk about Apple Vision Pro.
Yeah.
I mean, the Oculus and Meta, all that seemed to sort of bring it to attention, and it just sort of went away. And that's my perception. You can correct me if it's having more of an impact than it is. Apple Vision Pro seemed to bring the notion of where this might go into the public perception, right? Talk from your perspective, as someone who knows more about this than most of us, what impact Apple Vision Pro has already had and what impact you think it will ultimately have on advancing this industry.
So I think mixed reality is the future. Don't get me wrong. I do think the pioneers and the guys who are leading the way are still on the meta side of things. So in terms of the Oculus and everything else as well,
Hmm.
I think that those guys are still kind of like, in my opinion, still leading in terms of that. I think in terms of what Apple's done. A lot of people buy into Apple because of the brand, if that makes sense. And I mean, Apple makes
Right, of
things
course, yeah,
really sexy as well. I think they've built a really cool piece of tech, but I still don't think they've found the real world application as yet in terms of that. And if you look at the actual use cases of what people are using them for, um, there's not much out there in terms of that.
yeah.
Like yeah,
Isn't part of the challenge getting something that developers will develop into and create an ecosystem?
and it's
Talk about that challenge because that seems to be a big barrier. And I
so
may
for
be
me, like, yeah, I think like, look, obviously, once developers start to get more familiar with the technology, with any technology that comes in as well, and that's why I said it will be the future. Once the
wrong.
guys started getting their hands on the thing, the other thing as well that's kind of a little bit of a stumbling block is the price point. So like
I was going to bring that up as well. Yeah, those things are
Oculus,
expensive.
Oculus, it is like Quest, the Oculus Quest 3 is about what, like $650
Mhm.
versus $3,500 in terms of Apple Vision Pro, for example.
Right. I mean, the
Price
perception is that that price will go down over time, but it may not ever be
yeah.
cheap. Right. I mean, it will never be cheap,
But
probably.
that's the thing. So I think like that is the bigger kind of thing. The price point I think is also a little bit of a barrier in terms of that.
Hmm.
But I do think like from a development perspective as well, once the guys start getting there and the tech, also developing for the technology as well, I think it's going to become table stakes in terms of mixed
Yeah.
reality moving forward. I think that's where we're heading with regards to that.
Okay. So assuming this sort of app ecosystem, people developing for apps to be used in this environment
Mm,
takes up in the way that you might hope, or
mm.
enthusiasts about this space might hope. What things that we do on our phone using a SaaS application or just a regular mobile app? What things do you think are going to transition into that environment, or is that even the right question? Kind of how do you see the things we're doing on our phone evolving into the things we do through a mixed reality device?
So I think it's the way we interface with technology will fundamentally change how we move
Hmm.
forward as well. So I think like think about how you started off with utilizing your phone. Your phone was basically just for a clock and making calls and sending SMSs
Yeah,
back in the day. And now it's literally become the kind of like digital ID for lack of a better word.
texting, doom scrolling, and taking pictures.
Anything else like you are texting, taking pictures, but your banking apps, your
Right.
card, I don't even carry a
Your
wallet.
life, essentially.
My
Yeah.
life essentially, I don't carry a wallet with me. Like sometimes my battery dies and I'm like, oh my god, like how am I gonna pay for something? What am I gonna do? I don't even have my physical card on me. So I
Yeah.
think it's the way that we interact with technology will fundamentally change as technology kind of moves forward as well. And like
Hmm.
I mentioned, the use cases of what we're doing as well. So the power of virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. Just think about it in a training and development space, is that you can run real life training simulations at a fraction of the cost,
Hmm.
um, saving companies money. So, like what we've done, we've worked with clients as well, where, for example, big mining clients,
Hmm.
um, you can scan the mine, create a realistic version of the mine in virtual reality, run simulations of mine collapsing, anything else, and you can marry it with physical technology as well. So, think about it like creating the simulation and taking actual actuators that mimic the movement of everything as well. While
Okay,
you
so
have,
you can train for
yeah,
handling a mine disaster in a much safer
train
way and a more realistic way.
Any, anyway, and then the more
Yeah.
exciting part about that as well is that from training and development is I'm starting a new job, and what would happen is effectively someone would have to go out of their role for the day to train me and take me on a tour and do whatever and that stuff. What you need to
Mhm.
do with the onboarding perspective as well. But what you can do is also plug artificial intelligence in virtual reality. So you
Mhm.
could put an artificial intelligence being with the knowledge and be able to train someone, physically show them, physically do things. Anything that you can create simulations of, anything you can dream of, you can basically create that simulations, creating
Mhm.
more effective training, more immersive experiences. But I do think it's going to form part of it. Like I think in the future we're not going to be walking around with actual physical phones. It'll almost be overlays of mixed reality moving forward.
So my question there, and from this, I want to kind of get into some kind of the B2B. We sort of got into it, but
Mm.
so I was watching a television news show, and a journalist I follow closely, Kara Swisher, U.S. based, but you may have heard of her. She does a lot of
Yeah.
tech podcasting and journalism, and she was on a talk show wearing an Apple Vision Pro,
Yeah.
and it's a large device,
Yeah.
and the journalist sitting next to her said, "That is so." I forgot the word she used, but you know, isolating, I think is the word she used.
No,
And
yeah.
that it was like, how do you interact in the real world with somebody wearing this large? It kind
It's
of creates
bizarre,
a
right? Like it's strange to see someone walking around with like
yeah.
thousands of
But the
them.
point there was, and then what Kara Swisher said immediately after was, well, eventually this is just going to be a pair of glasses.
And like we've
Talk
seen,
about that. What is because there is that sort of if you put something on your face, it creates that sort of almost an emotional barrier between you and the next person. So how does that get solved? And what do you
so
think is the ultimate the ultimate
in
device
in device kind of
configuration? Yeah,
like look like there's actually been a lot of experiments around like glasses as well. I mean, Google Lens,
because
you
there
can
was
see
Google Glass, and that
like
was
Google
interesting, but it's not around. Yeah,
it's not around as well. But I mean, there have been some, and there are some devices in terms of smart glasses that are out currently now as well.
right.
Obviously, as the technology gets better, and like generally anything, like everything starts off like remember the back in the day was it still diode one where the guys were walking around with a suitcase with a cell phone in it, that big
Mhm.
as
Yeah, I remember
suit.
those days.
Like you remember those big phones, which was
I
like
remember the first cell phone I ever saw, mobile phone I ever saw, was the size
I
of a
mean,
shoe.
I
Yeah,
think we're giving our
a lot.
age away by having this discussion, Charles, but but that's generally where we started at. And look at
Yeah.
the ability to actually have a foldable phone in your pocket in terms of that.
Mhm.
The technology keeps getting better. I do think it's going to be some sort of interface. It could be a lens, it could be a glasses, it could be
Mhm.
to a point where we actually build contact lenses, Charles. That's how far we could go in terms
Well,
of
the
that.
win, I guess, is the
Yeah.
win, and how widely distributed will that technology be?
Yeah, so I think like obviously within time, I think like moving the most practical solution would be actual pair of glasses. I think that would come out. So minimizing the actual bulk around it enough, fairly bulky now at this moment in time, but obviously moving towards like a glasses kind of scenario as well in the next 5 to 10 years probably. And then after that, the sky's the limit.
Okay.
Technology, especially when things are invented, right? It's the term before things are invented and when things are in use, the rapidness of innovation in that space kind of like ticks up as well when people
Yeah.
start to push the boundaries.
So adoption drives innovation, is what you're saying.
Exactly, adoption drives
It's
innovation, and
chicken and egg. Has a bit
yeah,
of a chicken and egg vibe to it.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, hundreds, yeah.
Okay. And just sort of backing up a little, I think that sort of chicken and egg challenge, you know, this space has been, I mean, some version of it has been around for a while, right? I mean, we've been talking about AR, VR for a while.
Yeah.
And maybe you've already touched on it in some of what you said. What do you think has held it back? Is it the cost of the device? Is it something else that has prevented it from becoming other than the Pokemon Go craze a few years ago? What
No,
has uh, what has held this back?
so I think two things. I think it was obviously the technology was expensive at the beginning, and I think it's
Yeah,
getting to a cheaper
still is
price.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, still is
Mm-hmm.
relatively, but I think it's getting to a price point where it's becoming more palatable, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
point number one. Point number two is just the misconception and understanding around the technology. So, for example, people actually don't know how far the technology has come from a virtual reality perspective, and we see this every day when we deal with clients.
Could you
When I
illustrate that with an example or two, kind of where we were, where we are?
so think about it in terms of probably like 5 years ago. Like, I mean, even from a graphics perspective and processing perspective, it was very, it didn't feel very virtual. It felt very, like graphics wise, also creates an immersive experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the graphics processing power was there in terms of creating really realistic kind of
You
experiences.
felt like you're inside of
Yeah,
an
you could
old school
definitely
video game.
virtual reality. So you could definitely feel the difference. And I think that the way the technology has progressed, it's obviously moved quite further.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're putting yourself in these immersive experiences now, it's becoming more and more realistic. And I think it's one thing talking about it, but it's a different thing experiencing it. And we see this all the time. I'll tell a client like this, and this is what you can do. Like I'm talking to you about training and development, for example, or taking the volcano example in education. Like, and it's one thing me talking about it. When I put you in it, you can truly feel the, oh my God, I'm in the middle of the volcano. Oh my God, I feel unsettled. Even a
Mm-hmm.
simple thing like walking the plank on top of a high-rise
I'd rather
building.
do that in a VR
Yeah,
setting
it's in a
than
like
in real life.
you think to yourself, right? Like, okay, I'm on solid ground. How scary could it be? Put on the headset and walk the plank, and then
Mm.
tell me how you feel and like how realistic and like from a senses perspective
Yeah.
actually feels.
Well, you mentioned like the mining
Mm.
accident training where you can create the vibrations, and because we have multiple senses, not just our eyes. You know, we feel things, we hear things. How advanced is it to create that fully sensory experience, and kind of where does it need to get in order for that to be truly realized? Uh, you know, to feel
Um,
the vibrations, to hear the explosions, to feel the heat, for example. Yeah,
so I think like obviously like in terms of feeling other different elements as well, there are you could build simulations in terms of like how you could feel those elements as well. But I
yeah.
do think from a general perspective, just putting on the headset, the your brain, it's a very odd thing. Your brain just kind of flicks a switch, and it feels real to you, even from a motion
So if the
perspective.
reality is real enough, the other
The,
senses sort of come
the other
along for
senses
the ride.
come along for the ride effectively,
Okay.
and it kind of
Okay.
like allows you to become immersed in the environment. If you want to
Okay.
call it.
Okay. So I want to sort of wind down with how you work with. I mean, correct me at any point, but you work with corporate clients for the most part, right?
Yes.
How how do you talk to them about this? And you mentioned training. It feels like that's the big way it's being used now, or maybe into the near future, or maybe into the long term future. But what are some of the other ways? And again, corporate can be a bank, it can be a mining company, it can be any number of things. Give
Mm.
me a few examples of how this technology will really help banks cut costs, do more, whatever it is. You know, I
Mm.
don't know, cutting costs is the main motivation here, but talk about where this is going in a corporate setting. And then I'd like to ask you if you have any thoughts on how smaller businesses can use it.
So just in terms of like corporate setting, like let's look at different obviously corporate's quite broad. Retail experience, like I spoke to you about like store planning, different other
Mhm.
things, elements as well, creating goods as well. I think in the manufacturing industry is kind of where it really kind of kicks in as well. So imagine doing you could actually do, for example, every yard has a forklift, right? For example, like moving big machinery in terms of all the different other stuff as well.
Mhm.
You could do forklift training in virtual reality and train guys to get their forklift license in a virtual reality environment and actually
Without
do
dropping
all
a
the
pallet of
training, right?
expensive
Dropping a
goods.
pallet on someone's kind of thing. You could have one setup in terms of having the actual rig, putting in virtual reality and kind of putting those things together. Think
Mhm.
about any component. So if you work in machinery or anything else as well, imagine being able to put on a headset, look at one piece of machinery, explode it into components, and being able to see how each component actually works in there and how it all comes together, and then
Mhm.
physically build that with regards to that as well. So that's effectively like another use case as well. Real estate, anything from like housing, building. Um, like when we think about building actual buildings, one of the biggest thing people would talk about when they building houses or anything else is that sometimes the guys build it, and when the client comes afterwards, they're like, "Hey, like this doesn't look like what I wanted." Effectively, you could
Mhm.
build the entire building in virtual reality. Building it in virtual reality, take a client through a walkthrough, for example, in
Mhm.
real estate, and then basically before you actually put one physical brick down. So that's amazing in terms of like
Mhm.
changing the game and saving costs because it does effectively like play into that as well.
You know, again, this is my inference. It feels like cost savings and safety are two big drivers here.
Cost savings, safety, education, learning development. Those are
Yeah.
kind of like the big kind of points as well. Because a lot of the times you'll be amazed how much cost and how much physical labor comes into this whole thing. So think about it like this: like taking someone from a training and development perspective, taking someone out of work, taking them through the risk of taking them through a busy factory, taking them through different scenarios, and that it's time is money, and money is effectively time. So pulling all those things together, that's kind of where the cost saving comes from as well.
Mhm.
The retail example I like using because it's bizarre. Like, did you know, like when people do retail chains do Christmas decorations or Easter decorations within a store,
Mhm.
what they generally do is they physically dress up one store, take photos, or sometimes fly everybody down
Yeah, okay,
to
so that's like a demonstration project.
and
Yeah.
then be like, hey guys, walk around the physical store, take photos, and then when you go back to your areas, like build the physical store for Christmas and
Do
for
what we
Easter.
just did here, right?
Exactly, yeah. So
Yeah.
like think about it like that. So like a lot of cost savings, a lot of education, a lot of learning and
So
development.
instead, you do that in a virtual environment. No one has to fly anywhere, etc.
No one
Yeah.
has to fly anywhere. You can do stuff. Another practical example that I could give you is we built for one of the big financial services company in South Africa a secure VR boardroom where they could meet, the executives could meet, do presentations, like physically sit in the
Yeah.
boardroom, write on a whiteboard, everything saves. It was on top of Table Mountain for your US viewers who are not aware of Table Mountain. You can Google it. It's like one of our iconic places in Cape Town.
Yeah. No,
Top of
I've
Table,
climbed it
yeah, you've
once.
climbed it before. But on top of
Yeah.
Table Mountain, being able to do that, interact, do everything else as well, and like still have private conversations where they need be as well. It's like another
Okay.
practice use case.
So does this ultimately replace Zoom, and all the other video conferencing applications we use, or does Zoom embrace this and become one of the key players, etc.? I'm kind of wondering how the corporate, who owns a space changes as a result of this. And I don't
I
expect
think
it to happen not
yes.
next week, but over time.
Yeah. I think over time, like I think it'll be a mix of the two. I think like I think a lot of the guys are looking into it as well, especially like from a Microsoft perspective or like
Mhm.
Zoom or Google perhaps. I mean, Google's pretty much invested in like the Oculus as well in terms of that. So
Right.
either it would be an application on virtual reality or it would be effectively them starting up something else themselves.
Okay.
But I think the technology is there and the enabler is there. It's basically just like kind of
Yeah.
moving into that direction, kind of moving forward.
And early in this conversation, I sort of gave you that example of the plumber having
Mm.
the homeowner or whatever point their camera at the whatever needs to be fixed. We don't
Yeah.
have to get into that, but and they'll and then they can give instructions, for example, on, let's say it's restarting the, that may not be a plumber, restarting the boiler or whatever it is,
Yeah.
but that's a small business example, I guess, of how it could be used,
And
right?
it's
And do you have other thoughts on how a local home service tradesperson or a small retail? You mentioned retail, and that sounded like a big retail application,
no,
but it
no.
could be a small retail application as well. Talk about how a small, just a very 1-2 person business operation can apply this effectively.
So and it's like I think like there are different like different applications for it as well. I think
Hmm.
training and development and building up talent within your small business as well. Point number one in augmented reality, you can start to overlay any physical interface and start to pull data from there. So think about it from a small example, like there was an insect company, and basically what you could use augmented reality for even scanning different types of hives as well and getting some data and plugging AI into that as well, so you
Hmm.
could look at something and basically like pull those things together as well. But and bringing up information about the specific how everyone could do that in pest control.
Yeah,
That's one typical example as well.
I'd
But I do
rather
think
deal with virtual bugs than real ones. Right?
yeah, definitely not my forte either. But I think like simple kind of as the technology becomes like more used and more adopted, I think that's where we're gonna kind of head as well in terms of small
Okay.
business.
Final question.
Mm.
Inevitable question is, well, I'll ask it this way: how do other emerging technologies intersect with AR, VR to advance it? For example, I mean AI. How is AI going to intersect with AR, VR? Probably already is in some way. Talk about that just for a minute as we wrap up.
So I think that like a lot of people are looking at emerging technologies as separate veins, right? So, for
Mhm.
example, you look at virtual reality, you look at augmented reality, you look at AI, but the intersect is really combining everything together. So, utilizing artificial intelligence to pull data and pull it into the virtual environment or augmented environment is where the future is heading.
Am I
Um,
fair saying it's been there for a while? AI has been driving this for a while.
I would say that AI has been driving data like for a while now. I think that's coming in, but pulling it in is fairly new
Okay.
in terms of. I wouldn't say we've like polished it off in terms of that, but you do have the ability to create artificial intelligence in virtual reality that kind of pull things together as
Are
well.
we talking about generative AI in that context, or
Generative AI as well. So, for example, we've looked at how do you build a artificial trainer
okay?
in artificial intelligence trainer in virtual reality. So the person you speak to in natural language, and it learns and it pulls up from a specific data set. So think of taking all your training material and plugging it in and putting and having a natural conversation, and that being learning from a machine
Mhm.
learning perspective.
Yeah.
The other thing as well is, I think, like, which ties into another use case which might give you that, is the first time a doctor operates on you for a specific procedure is when you lay on the table at some point in time. And I don't know about you, that's a scary thought.
No one likes
With
that. Yeah, yeah.
with virtual reality, you could run simulations of the operation,
Right.
and actually like kind of do things like that. And
That
at the
is an
same,
existing use case, right? I mean, that's being
it's
done
like
now. Yeah.
that's it's like a lot of people are talking about it, and it's we also working with a couple of companies in this vein as well, trying like
Mhm.
building out that. And I think there have been a couple of things that have been done as well. But think about it one step further. Think about pulling in like AI and then starting to understand actions versus reactions. So what happens if you do cut this? What happens further down the line in terms of the rest of the stuff? So it starts to get you thinking. I like the amount of data and the amount of things that you can do, and like how you kind of do that from there as well. So it's such an exciting space as well, because
Yeah.
as
Well,
we see
you cite the
things are,
mining example of like, simulating a mine
yeah,
collapse and how
kind
do you deal with that? You could just as easily simulate a operation that's gone awry, for example, or I mean, airplane simulation's been around for a very, very long time. I would
yeah,
imagine this is playing a big role in that, at least it will.
and,
Yeah.
uh,
And, simulating things that go wrong in a very realistic way helps people prevent them from going wrong in the real world. I mean, I assume that's a big piece of this, right?
and it's, even if you look at Formula One, if you put any Formula One
Yeah.
fans as
There's
well,
another good one. Yeah.
simulation in terms of like running the tracks and like getting in some simulation training as well. So guys
Mhm.
actually like spending a lot of times on the sims. You'll hear them talk when they talk about when they do interviews as well. We're doing a lot of simulation work in terms of that, actually translating into what's happening on the track,
Mhm.
training and development. If you think about it, so yeah, interesting thoughts
Great.
around that.
So, any last words on this space? On sort of the average business owner, what should they be doing to learn more about this in a practical way? I'm not saying going out and buy a Apple Vision Pro necessarily, but what are some
Yeah.
practical things a business can do to start thinking about how this is going to change their business, help their
Mm.
business, and what should they know now in order to be ready?
And it's, I think, like the most important thing is just stay abreast of what's happening with the technology. I think that's point number one as well.
Mhm.
And I think like it's such an exciting space for me because the use cases are becoming more and more practical. The technology is becoming better and better, and I think it's a space that's really going to change fundamentally how we interact with each other, how we interact with people, how we connect, and how we engage with technology, kind of moving forward as well. And yeah, like I think just keep abreast of what's happening, because I think the biggest thing in like there's the this acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous world we live in as well. If you don't keep your finger on the pulse in terms of what's coming, you'd always be caught, kind of found wanting a little bit later. So you'll be a late adopter in terms of what happens in that perspective as well. And I think, like, yeah, if there is anything else that you guys would like to know or like engage with, you can reach out to me on various social forums. Happy to kind of have a conversation. It's something I'm very passionate about, and like something that I'd love
Great.
to have a conversation with you about.
We will include those in the show notes. And
Yeah.
MTIs, it seems like a great place to end it. And we really
And
appreciate the conversation. It's been fun. I've learned something, and I hope the audience will as well.
perfect. Thank you so much, Charles. It's really like amazing to be on this podcast as well. And yeah, I enjoyed the conversation as well.
The BIG5D podcast is written, hosted, and produced by me, Charles Laughlin, editor-in-chief of BigFive Digital. Thanks to today's guest, Imtiyaz Mohamed of Realm Digital. If you're interested in participating in this podcast as a speaker or as a sponsor, please reach out to us at info@big5digital.org. That's info@big5digital.org. Please rate and review the podcast. That really helps us. And thanks for listening.